For those of y'all who attended our sort of third special session wrap up yesterday afternoon, a lot of this is going to look pretty familiar. And so I do have a couple of Region 1 specific data points here that I'll touch on, but a lot of it is the main focus of today's presentation is going to be on just what happened during the third called special session and kind of looking forward to next legislative sessions. If my computer is going to cooperate there we go. Okay, so I'm going to just real quickly touch on the hold harmless. I'm still getting a couple questions on that from some folks on Region 1, so just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. The main sort of policy area that legislators focused on during the most recent special session was property taxes, so we'll touch on that. I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time on accelerated instruction, but just wanted to point out maybe some items that we can bring into future legislative sessions in terms of how we can get some relief from some of those requirements under House Bill 4545. And then I'll finish up with some other bills and other items that were debated and discussed during the third called special session. So as y'all know by now, the hold harmless that the state instituted during the 2021 school year, all that really did was essentially, if you benefited from the hold harmless, that just meant you had to spend your ESSER $2 to get your budget back up to the hold harmless level. There was no new state aid included in the hold harmless last year, right? It fully relied on your ESSER $2. So in this example that I have on the slide here, this district, you can see that their funding with the hold harmless ADA was higher than their funding with their actual ADA. And so that delta between those two, that essentially comes out of their ESSER II, right? Their ESSER II allocation is supplanting their state aid. If we switch gears to a district that their actual ADA came in higher, their funding under their actual ADA was higher than their hold harmless ADA. For this district, all of their ESSER II is going to flow to them as supplemental revenues, as new money. They're not going to have to use any of their ESSER II allocation to bring their budget back up to the hold harmless level. They can use it all sort of as the feds intended, right, to provide new programs, new initiatives to help get kids caught back up. So that's kind of at a very high level how the hold harmless last year worked. Across the state, we saw about 63% of districts were hold harmless districts, in that they had to use their ESSER II, or rather their hold harmless funding. The funding from the hold harmless ADA was higher than the funding from their actual ADA, and so they had to use their ESSER II allocation. About 37% of districts saw higher funding under their actual ADA. Statewide, the ESSER II allocation was $5 billion. The ESSER II, the portion of that used to supplant state aid for the hold harmless was about $1.1 billion. So that's about 20%. I'm looking at Region 1's numbers. You guys received around $774 million in ESSER II allocation, but you only had to use about 7-8% of that for hold harmless. So I would say, that's obviously much lower than the statewide experience. So generally speaking, a lot of Region 1 districts saw sort of a greater portion of their ESSER II allocation come to them as supplemental revenues. And I think part of the reason is, remember, ESSER II is tied back to Title I allocations. And so, we know Region 1 gets, a substantial amount of Title I funding. And so because you had sort of a bigger pie, you had, the share that you had to use for the hold harmless was relatively smaller than it was statewide. So I think that's some good news there for Region 1. And y'all have probably heard me make this point a couple of times now, but I'm gonna get on my soapbox here for a minute. But when we look at the sort of what lawmakers budgeted for the 2021 school year. Sort of the initial indication of that is what was on the LPE side of your summary of finance, right? That's sort of what lawmakers expected to pay going into the school year. If we take those numbers, the LPE ADA for every district in the state, and add them up, comes out to about 5.15 million ADA. So that's sort of what their expectation was, what they budgeted for. When we go and look at all the actual ADA for school districts, or what y'all reported on PEMS, that comes out to around 4.97 million. Then we look at all the hold harmless ADA. Take that column from TEA spreadsheet, add that up, that comes out to about 5.11 million. Remember, the hold harmless is the better of, right? The better of your actual versus your hold harmless ADA. So some districts are going to benefit from actual, most districts are going to benefit from hold harmless. So when we take the better of for all of those districts, that ticks up to 5.14. So you can see that we are pretty much exactly what the legislature budgeted for originally for the 2021 school year. So this argument that lawmakers had to use ESSER 2 to pay for the hold harmless, I don't think that's really supported by any of the data that's available now that the dust has kind of settled on this. And so just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that point, and that you guys were, to the extent you wanted to relay that on to your legislators, I think that could be a worthwhile talking point there.
So Josh, what you're saying is that the state paid them back with their own money.
That's exactly right.
Just checking.
Good morning, Buck. Just want yeah. So I think that's not only did they pay you back with their own money, but they want you to be thankful for that, right? They're still patting themselves on the back for providing a hold harmless, but they didn't use their own money and they took resources away from y'all that were really needed to provide new programs and hire new staff, right? That's what the purpose of the stimulus dollars were. And they ate into that with this hold harmless. And that's not what we saw across a number of other states. And so, I think that's feedback that legislators certainly need to hear from school districts. All right, and so there's been some questions on the 21-22 hold harmless. There was a section in House Bill 1525 that essentially prevents TEA from offering the hold harmless in the same way that they had, right? But they sort of artificially increase your ADA up to a hold harmless amount. And so that option is kind of off the table. So again, sort of how they did it this past school year. And so in TEA's attempts to try and provide some relief to folks during this school year, they made a pretty minor change to the eligibility around the low attendance day waiver. And that came out in the most recently proposed student attendance accounting handbook. And essentially what it does is it helps you meet that 10% threshold for the low attendance day waiver. And before I kind of move into the details on that, it doesn't give you more days, right? So as y'all are aware, you get sort of 10 days or 4,200 minutes total for waivers, right? And that includes development, development day waivers, these low attendance day waivers, all those sorts of waivers that you can apply for. So that remains the same, the 10-day, 4,200 minute cap. That didn't change. The only thing that changed is now when you're trying to select the individual days for the low attendance day waiver, that this 10% threshold may be a little bit easier to hit. And that's because you can now use the higher of the first 6 weeks of the 1920 school year, or the average attendance rate for the 2021 school year. And so again, for those that are new to this waiver, a day becomes eligible if it's less than 10%, I'm sorry, if it's more than 10% below the average attendance rate from either of those two periods, right? So usually it's just the preceding year. But now they've added essentially that the average attendance rate from those first 4-6 weeks of the 1920 school year, it's kind of the pre-pandemic period, right? And so presumably your attendance rate would be normal-ish during that time. And so, to the extent that helps y'all, you can apply for that waiver, and that will help y'all essentially remove those days from your ADA calculation. A couple of things to note there. This will not help you if you have an enrollment problem, right? So if and this is many Region 1 districts that I've talked to so far this school year, they do have maybe their attendance rate is lower, but they also have an enrollment problem. Kids just aren't coming back at the same levels as normal. And so this doesn't really help you with that. And so really what this is going to be geared towards is if you have to shut down a campus due to an outbreak or something like that, you can use this waiver to remove those low attendance days from your ADA calculation. And I'm gonna, since we're kind of talking about ESSER and ADA, I'm gonna pivot here just a little bit to some new ESSER guidance. On one of the recent commissioner calls, Commissioner Morath pointed out that in sort of the agency's initial review of a lot of these ESSER 3 plans, the use of funds plan, the safe return to in-person instruction plan, a lot of them were found to be non-compliant. And so I'm sure Region 1 has some federal program folks you can reach out to on that. We're happy to take questions as well. I know the agency has an inbox set up for questions related to ESSER 3. And so if you do have questions about what needs to be in those plans, what doesn't need to be in those plans, how often they need to be reviewed and sort of refreshed, where they need to be posted, please reach out to those resources and make sure you're in compliance there. I think if I recall on the last commissioner, or on the last superintendent call, the agency had reviewed somewhere around 100 school districts, and I think only 5 of them were found to be like totally in compliance. We've reached out to the agency to try and see if they can identify for us a sort of a gold standard or a district that got everything right. So that way we can pass that example on to y'all. Once we get that, we'll be sure to share that out. And then the other thing to note there is due to sort of an IT glitch on the agency's part, they were not able to roll out the remaining 1/3 of ESSER 3 funding as quickly as they would have liked. So remember that remaining 1/3 was hinging on the federal government's approval of the state's plan. Well, the state's plan has been approved. It was approved this summer. So it's been a while, and many other states that have already gotten their plan approved have rolled out the remaining 1/3 of ESSER 3 allocation. But because of the way the agency set up that ESSER 3 application, they can't amend it as easily as they would have liked. So they're still processing that initial round. And then in late November, early December, I think they'll have that issue fixed, and districts will be able to amend their application and access their remaining 1/3 of that allocation. Let's see. So now I'm going to switch gears to property taxes. And this is, again, really the main focus of at least the main sort of public education related focus of the third called special session. This first slide just provides some context. These are just the costs of the tax compression under House Bill 30. And so you can see started off at 1.9 billion in the first year of House Bill 30. And it's since grown to about 4.2 billion. And that's based on the data that school districts across the state submitted on the local property value survey. And so you can see just with the compression under House Bill 3, those costs are really growing pretty quickly year over year. But the legislature didn't want to stop there. They felt like property owners needed additional tax relief. And so we saw two sort of very different property tax relief proposals come out of the House and Senate during the third special session. The Senate had its version of Senate Bill 1, and then the House had its own version of Senate Bill 1, and then they added House Bill 90 on top of that. And we'll kind of go into some detail on sort of what those two chambers were proposing and sort of where they ended up. So the Senate side of things, we got sort of a lot of concern from school districts about this proposal. And this was really the first one to kind of the first one to be released during the special session. Essentially what they wanted to do is use $2 to $4 billion to provide temporary M&O tax rate compression. So they would buy down your MCR, right, your tier 1 portion of your M&O rate. They'd use sort of excess state funds to do that, but they'd only do it for 1 year during the 22-23 school year. So during the following school year, your MCR would sort of go back up to sort of House Bill 3 levels after that. And so, you know, this would obviously be a tax increase for a lot of folks. And I think it would create a lot of confusion and resentment towards school boards. And so there was a lot of concern on, you know, why are you just doing this just for 1 year? It's you know, it's going to create all this confusion with taxpayers. And so I think the House at least heard that message. I think that's what kind of that motivated sort of their proposal, which I'll touch on here in a minute. And also, if you listen to any of the Senate debate on their proposal, they were very concerned about school districts going out for a bunch of bond elections in the 22-23 school year, and sort of that would result in increased INS rates. That would eat into the compression that they just paid for on the M&O side. And so they talked round and round in circles on this. I think they maybe figured out that they didn't want to, you know, they didn't want to be too, you know, bring the hammer down too hard on INS rates, given, you know, the impact that would have on the bond market. So their sort of solution, or where they sort of landed on this, was just prohibiting TREs in the 22-23 school year. And if you think about it, it really would have acted as a 2-year prohibition on TREs, because, well, one, it would be outright prohibited in the 22-23 school year, but in the 23-24 school year, your MCR is going to go back up because, again, this was just temporary tax compression. So the tier 1 portion of your rate's going up. And then, you know, then you're going to go to voters to ask for additional tier 2 pennies in that same year. I think that would be politically very difficult for a lot of districts. And so realistically, I think you know, on paper, it was a 1-year prohibition, but I think in practice, it would have been really, really hard to do a TRE in that second year. There were some changes to the ballot language for future TREs, and then they also required that tax bills that were sent out include the amount of tax reduction due to Senate Bill 1. So it would have said, you know, due to the generosity of the Texas legislature, your tax rate was reduced by X amount of dollars. Now, there wasn't a requirement to put a similar notice the following year when tax rates went back up and tax bills increased. And so that's, you know, I think that's something that's important to note. They would have just let school districts bear the brunt of explaining that, but they wanted to make sure they got their credit for the tax rate reduction in the first year. Switching over to the House, the House took a really almost a completely different approach. They wanted to use $3 billion of the federal stimulus funds to send a check to each owner of a residence homestead. And again, this is the owner of a residence homestead. This would not have gone to business property owners. This would not have gone to renters. It wouldn't have gone, an owner of multiple homes, right, would not have gotten multiple checks, right? Under Texas law, you're only allowed one residence homestead. So that in that scenario, only one check would have been sent out. And so that would have come out to around $533 per resident homeowner in Texas. They crafted it this way, and they sent it, and the reason they wanted to send it out as a check rather than a reduced tax bill is because of the rules around sort of how the state can use this federal stimulus money. Generally speaking, you can't use the stimulus dollars to pay for tax cuts. And so that's why they sent it out as a check rather than a reduced tax bill. It's not completely clear that this would have gotten the green light from federal regulators on this. But I think that's really why it was crafted in such a way that they were trying to be mindful of those requirements from the federal government. So that's the first bill under the House's proposal. The other bill, House Bill 90, would have done some tax compression and would have paid for it with state funds. It would have required the state to dedicate 90% of general revenue surplus received above the spending limit. Would take 90% of that and dedicated it towards property tax compression beginning of fiscal year 2026. And so again, this is 90% of a surplus. So the surplus amount is going to vary from year to year, just depending on how the state finances shake out. But one scenario that was highlighted by the LBB and in their fiscal note, they sort of provided a range based on historical data. Sort of on the high end of that range, it put the cost to the state as high as $11.4 billion for one biennium. And so I think the main takeaway here is, this was a very, very aggressive proposal and a very aggressive sort of dedication of state funds to property tax compression. This would have sucked all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to future increases to the basic allotment or creation of new allotments under the foundation school program. It would have made it very hard for just any improvements to school finance in Texas, because again, all of that surplus revenue would have been dedicated to property tax relief. And one of the main things that the House was concerned about was they didn't like the temporary tax compression elements of the Senate's proposal. In House Bill 90, that tax compression would have been permanent. They didn't bother with any prohibitions on TREs or doing anything with the INS rate. This was just a compression on the M&O rate. The other thing I want to point out is that the spending limit that this is all tied to, this bill, that's still law. That was passed during the 87th regular session. And so that spending limit goes into effect in fiscal year 2026. And so that's still going to hinder future legislators from making additional investments in public education. So we dodged a bullet with House Bill 90, but we're not totally in the clear yet, because that's, again, that spending limit is still in law, and it's going to, future budget writers are going to have to, craft their budget in a way that's in compliance with that limit. There is a way, if you get a certain vote threshold, you can exceed that spending limit. So there are ways around it, but it's going to make it harder for the state to make those additional investments in public education. So as we think about what we need to do during the next legislative session, I think relaxing this new spending limit needs to be pretty high on the list of those priorities. And so I almost hesitate to call this a compromise where they landed, because, usually it would, the House had one position, the Senate had one position. They didn't meet in the middle. They just settled on something entirely different. And what they settled on, and this is passed and heading over to Governor Abbott's desk. I don't believe it's been signed yet. But it increased the residence homestead exemption from 25,000 to 40,000. And if you think back to when they increased this several years back, before it used to be 10,000, and then they increased it to 25,000. They put in place an additional hold harmless state aid to offset the impact of those lost property tax collections. So they've done something similar here, but the thing to note is, and they've done it both on the M&O and the INS side. On the INS side, though, they're only providing that hold harmless to cover the debt that was issued prior to September 1, 2021. Okay, and so if the existing debt that's out there, you'll get a hold harmless that will offset the tax collection loss due to this increased homestead exemption. However, for debt that's issued after September 1, you will essentially need to levy a higher INS rate than you otherwise would have, because you won't get that hold harmless to offset the lost property tax collections. So just be mindful of that this increased homestead exemption, they got to hold harmless for historical debt, for debt you've already issued, but debt after September 1, it will require a higher INS rate than you otherwise would have had to adopt. I'm seeing a couple questions pop up. Let me find my cursor and see if I can address some of those. Let's see. So one question came in back on SR2. Can you further explain when SR2 is supplanted versus supplemental? Okay, so essentially, and TEA, I think at the last FAC meeting, TEA showed this spreadsheet. Give me 1 second and I will pull it up here. Okay, can y'all see the TEA website?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so this is the State Funding Division website on TEA. TEA's website. I'm going to put the link in the chat, or here, let me find the report, and then I'll put that in the chat. So you go to State Funding Reports and Data. And they have these 2 new reports here. I will put the link to that Excel document in the chat so you guys can go find that. Let me download that real quick. All right, so I think this question came in from our friends in the SAR ISD. So let's look up their district real quick. So this is a spreadsheet I just downloaded from TEA's website. And it has all of their runs here. And so for you guys in the SAR ISD, you can see the funding that you received. And this is your PEMS ADA, so this is sort of your actual ADA that you submitted, was 3.4. You saw some remote ADA cap. I think we need to follow up with TEA on that, because I don't actually believe y'all were subject to the remote ADA, but essentially you lost 3.3 ADA it looks like between your actual ADA run and your capped PEMS run. So we can chase that down later on, but not a whole lot of ADA loss there. But essentially your hold harmless ADA was lower than your PEMS ADA, right? So you were an example of a district, if we think back to those slides I showed earlier, you would be in that 37% of districts that did not see higher funding from your hold harmless ADA compared to your actual ADA. And so for you guys, there would be no ESSER reduction, right? So you see, you don't have a row here that says ESSER reduction. Many other districts in the state, I'm just going to look at Abilene here, just because they're at the top of the alphabetical list here. So you can see Abilene, they have a row here that says ESSER reduction, right? So they will need to use 4.5 million of their ESSER 2 allocation to get their budget back up to that hold harmless level. So you can see their actual ADA, 76 million, their hold harmless, their budget with their hold harmless ADA was 81 million. So on their summary finance, you see this, it goes from 76 to 81. And then they ratchet it back down to 76. And then you're expected to make the difference up between those two numbers. Oops, zoom in here a little bit. There we go, that might be better. You're expected to make up the difference between those two runs with your ESSER 2 allocation, right? And so, and this is kind of what David Marks was talking about at the last FAC meeting. So if you do have an ESSER 2 reduction here, then you can recognize, so for Abilene's, in Abilene's case, they can recognize 4.5 million of ESSER 2 in 2021, regardless of when they got their NOGA. So even if they got their NOGA sometime in September, right, they can still recognize 4.5 million back in 2021. They could recognize that revenue in the previous school year. And so in Lasara's case, you guys did not see a benefit under the hold harmless. And so you guys would not be able to recognize that revenue in the prior year, according to the rules as I understand them from David. Someone was asking if the slides were available. And again, that's partly my fault. I got the slides to folks at Region 1 very late, so they will be posting them after the conclusion of the meeting, I believe. And so those will be made available later on. Jaime has some editorial comments there. Thank you, Jaime. Let's see. I don't think there's any other questions. Yeah, okay. All right. So again, back to Senate Bill 1 and sort of the bill that that was passed during this third called special session. The other thing to note, of course, is this requires this needs to be approved by voters. It'll go to voters in May of 22. And so, you know, it's very, very likely that it'll be approved. I think the last one passed like not, you know, by 90% or something. I mean, it was you know, very popular, tax relief is. So I don't think that there'll be any surprises there, but just know that this is not going to be immediately effective. We got to go to the voters and get it approved. So there'll be a little bit of a delay on the implementation there. All right. I'm going to just move quickly on this. You guys know when you're starting to sort of wrap your arms around House Bill 4545, you guys understand that you know, sort of what's required under there. You can, if the student fails STAR or just doesn't pass, you can put them with a teacher that has the KI designation. I know a lot of Region 1 districts are standing up those programs now, so that will be a big relief for y'all in terms of complying with 4545. or you can give them 30 hours of supplemental instruction. I think one important thing there is, if we look at all the tests that will trigger some sort of action under House Bill 4545, it's about 3.2 million tests based on our estimate. There's about 4,600 TIA teachers. Clearly, that's not enough to put a sizable dent into all of the tutoring that's going to be required. And so we think that's going to be about 90 million hours of tutoring across the state that'll be required under House Bill 4545. This is going to be a huge burden for folks. But I think if you just be mindful of the fact that you can space it out over the year, over the school year. It can be after school as well. And I think research, and I'm getting a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but based on sort of conversations I've had with folks in our on our accountability and academics team, it seems that the research they've reviewed kind of shows that that tutoring is best, the student is best served when that tutoring matches the student's needs as closely as possible. And so what that means is if they're really struggling with one specific concept, that tutoring should sort of ramp up during that time. And then if there seem to be mastering concepts, it can kind of ramp down. And so it kind of meets them where they are. And so I think that's, and if you were on our call yesterday, and we'll send out a recording of that as well, but they kind of go into some more details on sort of best practices on tutoring programs. And so if your academic folks are still trying to get those programs crafted and are struggling for some resources there, I think Terry and Tony yesterday pointed out some good best practices there. But kind of thinking about, how much this is going to cost to provide all these tutors and how we can get some relief from these extra costs. I think House Bill 233, while this was in the second called session, I think this was a good sort of roadmap for maybe some tweaks we can continue to ask for when it comes to 4545. So it didn't pass during the second session, but there were some good provisions in there that I think we can push for later on. It would have limited the type of tests that would have required some sort of accelerated instruction response to just math and reading, right? So cut down the number of tests there. It would have allowed y'all to put those tutoring groups, it would have increased the cap from 3 to 4 students, and even for 1 year, you can go up to 10 students for those tutoring groups. So that would have helped, right, bring down the cost of tutors, right? You would have needed fewer. And then I think that third bullet point there was particularly welcome by school districts. It would have allowed y'all to, all of those kids that required accelerated instruction based on the prior year test, if you got 60% of them to pass the STAR in the following year in the same subject, right? So if Johnny failed, didn't perform satisfactorily in math in the prior year, but passed the math STAR in the current year, and that would have counted towards that 60%. So if you get 60% of those kids passing STAR in the same subject, the commissioner would have been able to waive all of the accelerated instruction requirements for your district. And so I think that would have provided a big incentive and sort of a big carrot for school districts, and really helped, potentially help with a lot of those tutoring costs in the following year. So again, this bill didn't pass, but I think it's got some good elements that we can try and bring back in a future legislative session. Hopefully, hopefully not another special session. I think we all need a break from those, but maybe by the 88th, I think we'll be ready to start bringing some of these provisions back up for consideration. The other thing that I want to talk about is just some of the other bills that came out of the third called session, House Bill 25. I think this was the third time they tried to get this bill over the finish line. They finally did. This bill has to do with transgender athletes. It would have required that public schools only allow student athletes to participate in athletic competitions that align with the gender listed on their birth certificate at or near the time of their birth. So that's sort of the key change. UIL had a rule previously that sort of looked at the birth certificate, but it would have recognized birth certificates that were legally changed, since birth. Now this bill sort of limits that, and the UIL can only look at the birth certificate as it was issued, or rather schools can only look at the birth certificate as it was issued at or near the time of birth. And I corrected myself there because the enforcement of this, the onus is going to be on schools. It's the school districts required to not allow these students to participate. So that's how the enforcement on this is going to work. That second bullet point there notes that there's one exception to this. Female students may compete in sort of a competition that's designated for males if there's no sort of corresponding female competition. And so there is allowed to be some crossover there. The other bill that this really isn't public education related, unfortunately, but this was a major focus of the third special session, sort of how the state was going to divvy up the stimulus funding that it received. So you guys know you got all of your ESSER funds, right? That those were stimulus funds sort of directly towards public schools. The state got its own pot of money, and it totaled around 16.3 billion. I think they're saving 3 billion for other uses, but Senate Bill 8 appropriates the bulk of it there, about $13.3 billion. And some of the bigger ticket items are listed there. The largest portion is going to sort of shore up the unemployment compensation fund. That's $7.2 billion there. And I think that's really the purpose of that is if they didn't dedicate some state funds back to that unemployment compensation fund, which really got hit hard with those high unemployment levels we saw during the pandemic, sort of restoring the burden of restoring that fund would have fallen on private businesses. They would have had to pay more, their unemployment costs would have gone up. And so this was intended to help avoid that. The next item there, $500 million will go to broadband expansion. So, this was an issue across the state over the past 18 months. Providing online virtual instruction. There was a lot of issues related to internet access, and so this whole broadband expansion and sort of rural access to the internet, that priority really sort of rose to the top in a lot of ways during recent legislative sessions. And so this bill dedicates $500 million to expanding broadband access across the state. The bill also includes $286 million for TRS to pay for coronavirus related claims and TRS care and TRS active care. So I think that's great news. I think TRS had generally a pretty good session. They got some funds to bring them back to sort of being, I'm struggling to think of the word, actuarially sound. Sorry about that. So they got new funding there. They got this funding to pay for the COVID claims. And so I think TRS is in pretty good shape. And then obviously the 13th check that was passed recently. And so TRS is in pretty good shape after these sessions. And then right at the last minute, they tucked in that $3 million for the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. That's the only money that TEA receives under Senate Bill 8. There are some other sort of higher education initiatives and programs, and there's also sort of construction projects across the state that are funded in Senate Bill 8, and also another bill that came out during the legislative session. So higher ed got some money, TEA got a little bit of money for Big Brothers Big Sisters, but clearly they didn't use any of this money to pay for another hold harmless for this school year or anything like that. They could have done that. The rules that were published by the Department of the Treasury allows for those funds to be used for K-12. It could have been used to address educational disparities, promote healthy childhood environments, give premium pay to educators, provide assistance to high poverty school districts. Those 4 bullet points there come straight out of the Department of Treasury guidance. And so those were options that were on the table for the legislature, but they chose not to dedicate any funds to those priorities. The other main focus of this session was redistricting. There were new maps that were adopted for the Texas House, the Texas Senate, SBOE, and congressional districts. They've been adopted. There's already been lawsuits over them, and so we'll see kind of how those may change going forward. But here's kind of where things stand now. And as you would expect, these are partisan map makers, right? They're partisan actors that are drawing these maps, so they're going to act in partisan ways. They essentially, Republicans obviously control the House and the Senate and have the majority of the congressional districts. And so just across the board, they acted in ways to sort of further ensure Republican control of all of those bodies. And so in the House, we saw, so think about the current maps, 76 out of the 150 districts went to President Trump in 2020. Under the new proposal, so if that same election was held under the maps that were these newly proposed maps, that would have resulted in 85 of 150 districts going for Trump in 2020. When we look at the Senate, 16 out of 31 districts went to Trump in 2020. Under these new maps, 19 districts would have gone to Trump in 2020. With the SBOE, 8 out of the 15 districts there went Trump carried those districts, had a majority vote in those districts in 2020. Under the new SBOE maps, 9 of those districts would have gone to Trump in 2020. So, and with those changes, we're going to see some legislative turnover. I think Representative Talarico, who served on the House Public Education Committee, he's having to switch seats. And there's a number of other House districts. Some House districts got drawn in together, and so 2 incumbents will have to run against each other. And so we'll see some legislative turnover there. But I think we'll also see some turnover in sort of these key leadership roles in the House and the Senate. And that's mostly due not really to redistricting, but due just to folks retiring and just not seeking reelection. And so you can see some big names there on that list on this slide. Representative Dan Huberty is announced that he's not seeking reelection, and he's been a key voice on public education issues for years. Representative Jim Murphy, his name may not be as well known to folks on this call because he usually, he's been serving on the House Ways and Means Committee for years, but that committee has, they passed the bill for the property tax compression. They focus on all of the state's tax and revenue issues. And so, and he's been sort of a leading voice on that committee for a number of years. Senator Kel Seliger, again, that's probably a name many of y'all recognize. One of his main legislative contributions in recent years has been the IGCs and getting those passed. And so and he's sort of one of the few remaining moderate Republicans in the Senate. And so he has announced that he's not seeking re-election. And same with Senator Jane Nelson. She's been the chair of Senate Finance for a number of sessions. And so again, she's not heavily and, or I guess exclusively involved in public education issues, but, what she sets the budget. And so that inevitably is going to impact the school finance system. So again, we have some pretty big names that will not be coming back in future sessions. And so we could see, new folks stepping into leadership roles when we think of, when we come back for the 88th session. And then we have seen some calls for a fourth special session. We're not exactly sure when that might be, but it doesn't seem like there's any sort of political will to put any public education issues on the agenda for that. I think the main focus for this potential fourth special session would be around voting issues. So sort of increased penalties for voter fraud, perhaps an election audit, those kinds of things. There's been no discussion of having any property tax bills on that agenda or any public education bills on the agenda for that fourth special session. So this is just going to take a minute, but I just wanted to let y'all make sure y'all were aware. Oops, did I share the right thing? Yes, okay. This one, if you guys are doing a virtual program, there's some extra supports that they announced. It's really just technical assistance if you're trying to implement Senate Bill 15. And this TAA kind of walks you through that a little bit. And there's some training, some webinars, those kinds of things. And here's some dates. You can, the application was released yesterday. And so if you are interested in getting some technical support for virtual instruction through this virtual hybrid program accelerator, that was announced. And so I'm going to drop this in the chat. But I realized I had neglected to mention that during my presentation. So just want to make sure y'all were aware of that.